podcast, man, I listen to it regularly. Every time a new one comes out, I want to listen to it. And he definitely brings like key voices to the fore that have blessed me. And so it's just this gentle pushback that I offered yesterday. And I'll just re-articulate some of that in light of United Methodism, but also some other points and some other ways I like to give credit to those in the SBC who have been working to maintain their doctrinal standards. But just to re-articulate quickly, Dr. Mohler had suggested that Methodists were on a slippery slope because they had that the slippery slope was naturally leading to LGBTQ inclusion in light of the way that Wesleyan evangelicals had handled women in ministry and the way they approached those texts. And so Dr. Mohler suggested that they were trying, that such people like me were trying to get around those texts and get around the plain meaning of Scripture. And I don't think that's the case at all. And I think I don't want us in the Wesleyan tradition to mischaracterize those in the Calvinist tradition. And I recognize too, some people helpfully corrected me, distinctions between types of Baptists that there are. And it's different from some, there are those in Arminian camp, those in Reformed camp, then there's Reformed traditions like PCA and the like. So please forgive me, the novice who has never really been in the SBC world, but not wanting to pick on distinctives that exist within the Calvinist tradition as if those distinctives are a part of a problem that comes down the line later. So, I mean, essentially, and my good friend Kenny Johnston, who's a graduate of WBS, teaches logic at the Christian school connected to his church. Just remind me, this is indeed the slippery slope where conclusions don't necessarily have the same premises. And so in this case, getting around Scripture is not at all the way that evangelical Wesleyans who hold to inerrancy come to a belief in affirming women as pastors. So I know, and some people really got into me hard for this on YouTube, that I didn't give a full exegetical account of these type of things. So if you look at my show notes, and hopefully it's coming up in the comments, you'll see there that I footnoted. I gave links to two podcasts where I talk through this for more than an hour on various passages. And I think we just in general think that is no doubt that women in Scripture in the New Testament functioned in a prophetic role where they were speaking in church. And the way we look at this is through the canonical dialogue as opposed to the canonical monologue. So the canonical dialogue is where we look at those things that might appear to be different in Scripture, and we try to see how do we understand how these could fit together. And so if there's these distinctions, this is what leads us through the canonical dialogue, looking at all that happens in Scripture. And I want to point back particularly to my conversation with Murray Vassar, which is in the show notes. This just simple podcast titled, Can Women Be Pastors? And looking at that argument within the very fact that in 1 Corinthians, there are women who are prophets. And so then at the same time, he turns around and says he forbids them to speak in church. So we're able to think of this as a contextual situation. And so it's not this, and somebody was getting on to me too, say, oh, well, then everything's context. Well, in a sense, everything does need to be interpreted contextually. And what evangelical Wesleyan suggests is that looking at these passages and seeing them as being restricted to very specific situations is the appropriate way to interpret this. We don't come at it to try to get to another conclusion. So this is looking at all of the examples I talked about yesterday, all of the examples and you can look at my podcast here with Matt O'Reilly, who also teaches for us at Wesley Biblical Seminary, and our conversation with had the question mark, evangelical egalitarians, question mark. And is that an oxymoron? And I think that there are different ways that those labels, egalitarian and complementarian, don't really work. And there are many ways that evangelical Wesleyans in this kind of pan-Wesleyan world would affirm the complementary nature design of the human body. So, and even many who would affirm the role of headship. I know within the denomination I came from, I'm now in the Global Methodist Church, in the Salvation Army, there would have been an affirmation of headship by the founders of the Salvation Army. So that's certainly within the tradition. But at the same time, looking at these other passages about women speaking in church and giving freedom for that to happen, and then providing even for an opportunity for women to be ordained. So that's the canonical dialogue. But then on the other side, the canonical monologue is the one that suggests that there is clarity consistently within Scripture about the nature of what would be a part of the LGBTQ agenda, or the normalization of sexuality, of homosexuality in society today, and speaking against that from Scripture. Like, that's just a regular pattern. So I don't even have to go into that, or even to look at the canonical dialogue, looking at other examples that help us think about this differently, like the example of Deborah, this definite leader who functioned probably in, if we were to attach an office to it, a variety of offices. All right, that's just a little summary of what I said yesterday. But my hope altogether is just to say to those who might disagree with us, and I'm good at that. I like to go to ETS, Evangelical Theological Society. I like to read articles and books by people who disagree with me, even arguments like that say that Wesleyan evangelicals and those who may be involved in the Global Methodist Church or any of the conservative Wesleyan denominations are getting around Scripture, or trying to get around Scripture. That's just not the case. And I want to give you all that type of credit. So here I'm going to give a little bit more credit to my friends on the conservative side of the SBC, like Dr. Mohler. For instance, even though I probably align more with what Rick Warren has said on the conference floor of the Southern Baptist Convention, I totally support the fact that you all say, you should not be in our denomination anymore. Like, we have, and I forget what it is, Baptist Faith and Mission. I'm sorry, I forget the title of all the documents that came about. Like, clearly spoke about this more than 20 years ago, and you work through your hermeneutical approach, your theological approach, your theological appropriation, and I just say, go for it. Like, I don't see this as a matter of injustice. I look at this as a hermeneutical case, and I think that denominations within the SBC that want to move away from what you all have affirmed should move away themselves. And this is those of us in the Global Methodist Church and in the evangelical Wesleyan world who are like in the heart of what's happened with United Methodism. We just say, like, we see where this goes. Like, you can't have what we would call a discipline. You can't have a rule book and then not follow it. So I just want to bless my friends and say, I agree with you. You should be able to say to anybody who's going against your standard of faith, your hermeneutical perspective, and the way that you arrive at these passages to not affirm women in ministry, like, I don't say more power to you. I disagree with you. I love you in Jesus. We have so much more in common these days than I do with any liberal Methodist at the same time. So I want to offer that. At the same time, I also want to acknowledge that in my own camp, there are Wesleyan evangelicals who do operate with a hermeneutical perspective that Dr. Mohler suggests. They do try to get around Scripture. So it's common for some people to say they want to arrive at a certain conclusion, and they'll give up, say, well, I just don't agree with Paul, or they'll say, I went through the Bible and I made C's by all the verses that were Calvinist and W by all the verses that are Wesleyan, or whatever it is, and say there was more W's and C's. That was what my grandfather did. It was kind of a fun thing that he would say from time to time. But I don't think that that's how we have to come about this. And I think that too often evangelical Wesleyans lean into critical theory, DEI, and the like, and they use these sort of so many of even some of the doctoral dissertations I've seen on this subject within the tradition that I study in the Salvation Army use Foucault, other kind of Frankfurt School type of lens that sees everything as about power, this being a real problem. And this, I think, to Dr. Mohler's point, could lead to that. But that's not necessarily the premise that evangelical Wesleyans have. And I just want to encourage those of you in the evangelical Wesleyan tradition to go, we don't affirm this, we don't get around Scripture. We believe these things, and we can believe these things because of Scripture. And that's why I encourage you to check out the writings of Ben Witherington, his book about women in the early church. I mentioned yesterday Doug Groteis's book. Craig Keener's written a lot about this. And then I point to the scholars from the Wesley Biblical Seminary as well, particularly the work that kind of some popular articles by our own Murray Vassar, and Matt O'Reilly has published on this as well. So I encourage you to just check out a few of those resources and don't fall into that trap. Now, I will say, I want to give one example as I finish up here, where there is people who do try to get around Scripture. And this will get me in trouble with my Salvation Army friends. But I do think the Salvation Army is in danger of this because often the Salvation Army's approach to its non-sacramental position, which, in case anybody's already calling me a heretic, I've already published articles calling the Salvation Army to reintroduce the sacraments. Of course, they did practice the traditional dominical sacraments from 1865 to 1883. There was already procedures for how to do that, a theology that was behind it, but yet it was abandoned in light of William Booth saying he didn't want to be a church, but clearly he did make a church with 2 million members worldwide at this point. So there, and he even said in 1883, well, to be a church, there must be sacramental observance. And so he didn't want to be associated with a church. And so this led him to a paradox of creating a church that wasn't a church, that he said wasn't a church. And that was part of the problem with the Salvation Army. But what's happened now that we're 130 years removed from that time when William Booth no longer, about 130 years, no longer used the sacraments, this then put us in a position where people, and if you look at those of you who know the literature, David Reitmeyer's book on the sacraments in the Salvation Army, Holiness Foundations, published by Crest Books, outlines the heretical ways that people have defended the Salvation Army's stance. And a lot of this this has come with trying to arrive at a conclusion. And even, occasionally when I was an active Salvation Army officer, given the task of writing something defending the Salvation Army's position. Well, I need to be able to come up with a premise that supports that, or a logical flow to the argument. And too often in the Salvation Army, there is a spiritualization that tends towards doceticism that says, okay, when Jesus said, go into all the world and baptize, he meant spirit baptism. And we might say, oh, well, that's a hermeneutical approach. Well, I think there's not been a strong exegetical case to show that is indeed what is meant by Scripture. And then if we take even our interpretation and then we evaluate that in light of the interpretation of others or the history interpretation, it's just a very, very small, 99.99% of any denomination or Christian tradition that has affirmed this. And so here's what I think, that the Salvation Army violates its own first article of faith. The first article of faith in the Salvation Army says, we believe the scriptures of the Old and New Testament were given by inspiration of God, and they only constitute the divine rule of Christian faith and practice. So this is essentially like consistent with the Chicago Statement on inerrancy, and is we would affirm that we need to do the hard work to see the way that Scripture works together to support these views, to support our theology and our Christian faith and practice. And it doesn't seem to be consistent with any exegetical foundation outside of rejecting the authority of Scripture truly. Now, I know that people wouldn't say that, but really it does get around the text or suggest that some texts aren't a part of the original manuscript. Now, I know salvation will say, but what type of baptism? And here I'm talking to people in the SBC and the GMC and the Association of Independent Methodists and all these type of groups. And you might be saying, we'll all fight about this, but here's what they don't fight about. Doing them. And that's the Salvation Army's task. That's what the Salvation Army's interpretation has been. So I think, and those of you in the Salvation Army, listen to me here, that by abandoning what the church has always taught on sacraments, this then opens the door in that tradition to move toward, to use that same hermeneutical perspective, those same premises, then to move towards full LGBTQ inclusion. And these are exactly the arguments that are being used by the groups from the Salvation Army that are making these cases. So I wanted to just give a little bit more context for what I said yesterday in responding to Dr. Mohler. And again, know of my appreciation of him. I'd be glad to talk. I did write him a few times on this through the years. So I'm not just coming at him here and in this play. I'm not sure that he would even hear this. So that's fine. And then also just wanted to mention that Wesleyans have gone wrong in this area. And I just encourage you to check out the articles that I share below. And then also wanted to even think about the nature of how denominations define who they are and how we make these categories for who we live in a world with religious liberty. And this is the natural consequence of that we have denominations. I don't see that as a sin. And if you want to see the way a great academic expression of this, I would point you to Kevin Van Hooser's Biblical Authority After Babel, where it's the best response I've ever seen to, or I've ever read, to thinking about why there's diversity of denominations, but also just a bit of subtle warning for how some of these premises of moving past the authority of Scripture can be problematic. And I'm suggesting that evangelical Wesleyans have not done that as it relates to women pastors and women speaking in the church. So I appreciate you all checking this out. I have regular podcasts that come out generally on Thursday. Generally, they're interviews. I also have a few things that, if you've hung on this long with me, you can see at my website. I have a virtual course that I offer on Jude for Sunday school groups, small groups, and also have a course on the afterlife that's available. Those are like sessions that you could do across maybe this summer. You could check that out at andymillerthird.com. That's andymilleriii.com.